of interviewing. And what I came to find out that there was so much more to the story that he was telling me than just the idea of the POW MIA event that was held in 2012. So the story that I eventually wrote and have finished is really the story. It's a historical novel. It's based on kind of a simple premise, but a complicated story. The premise is this. This man, Russ Warner, was a crew chief on a helicopter in Vietnam in 1968. And on one day in 1968, he and his crew members were to fly a mission, but the helicopter that he was the crew chief on had already passed the 100-hour limit that the Army mandated needed an airworthiness inspection. So he was told he needed to do the inspection on the helicopter. But because of the time of the year, the Tet Offensive had started, the helicopter crew needed to fly more missions. And so the 3 other men in the crew were assigned to a temporary aircraft and given a new crew chief. He started the inspection, the other crew took off. After about 2 hours, the sirens and the horns were blaring at the base that he was working on, and he said to me, I'll never forget, I saw the base commander come running over to me, and he never ran. So I knew something was in trouble, something was happening. And so they ultimately took off, and they couldn't find the helicopter that he was supposed to be on. And they searched and they searched and they searched, and ultimately they found the helicopter after about a week, and on the helicopter there were in the helicopter there were 3 bodies, but the co-pilot was missing. And this really is the story. The story of this novel is really the story of that man who was the crew chief and how he got to Vietnam, how he became like a brother to these other men in the helicopter, and what happened to him in the succeeding years after the war. So anyway, what I thought I would read is one of, it's not the immediate opening to the book. The book is really written as a dual narrative. There are two protagonists that are really telling the story. One is, as I said, one is Russ Warner, who lived in Old Orchard Beach and now lives in Florida. And the other is a sort of a fictional character based on a boy that came from California and was ultimately the co-pilot in the helicopter. So this is chapter 3. It's titled The Boy from the Berkshires, December 1966. My family wasn't flashy. We didn't have piles of cash hidden in the bank or own the paper mill down by the river. We lived on the same 100 acres of land where my grandfather was born, and the fields I walked as a teenager were the same stretch of earth where my dad hunted turkeys every fall. The gentle rolling hills and valleys of western Massachusetts were my home, and I thought I'd never leave. I was wrong. Now I know I might never get back. For 17 years, I worked hard and learned the value of a day spent in the field, in the barns, in the garage. The Grandin dairy farm was about 1.5 miles down the road, and they always seemed to need some help with the chores. There were 2 or 3 full-time hands, but my dad knew Mr. Grandin. By the time I was 14, I worked there every Thursday and Friday afternoon after school, and then again on Saturday and Sunday mornings. Mr. Grandin paid everyone on Friday afternoon, just before quitting for the day. With the crisp bills neatly folded in their pockets, the other workers, Joe and Charlie, were anxious to spend the night in town. By the time the sun snuck over the horizon and said hello to Saturday morning, there was no waking them. That was okay with me. I kind of liked walking through the barns alone and tending to the herd. Days and seasons and years passed. Years were spent working the land, and by the time I decided to quit high school, my body was accustomed to the steady physical activity. Haying in the summer, planting in the spring, working with the animals and crops in the fall, and then plowing snow and repairing equipment all winter. The thick, rich smell of the land, the animals and the machinery, somehow it settled me, made me feel like I was where I belonged. Russ, where are you going? What are you going to do? Mr. Grandin said to me one Friday afternoon in December. Unless I missed my guess, you're going to be 18 soon. You've got to register. I knew what he was talking about, but I tried not to think about it. All boys had to sign up with the draft board when they turned 18, and I kept telling my girlfriend Sandy that I was going to be picked. I stopped walking toward the big gray sliding doors of the barn and just looked at the old man. I don't know, was all I said. For the last few months, this seemed like the only thing Sandy and I talked about, and we'd spend hours looking at the draft list in the newspaper. The small, handmade wooden dinner table in my house was turned into a library desk of sorts, and we would spread the Springfield Union over the length of the faded chestnut-colored pine boards. Sometimes 20 minutes or more would pass without a word from either of us. We'd just spend the time looking at the list in the line of birthdays printed in the paper and wonder how long it would be before my draft notice was unceremoniously dropped into the plain mailbox at the end of the driveway. Starting on the second page of the paper, the numbers with the draft were listed 1 through 365, and next to each number was a simple date. The dates represented birthdays, and the order of the dates indicated where you stood in terms of the draft. If your birthday happened to be near the top, you were likely to go. It didn't take me long to find my birthday, December 11th. It wasn't hard to find, it was just within the first few inches of black ink on the page. My number, lucky number 46, was likely to be drawn within a month or so. I didn't have many choices. I wasn't going to college, I hadn't finished high school, and a lot of guys I knew had already been drafted. They told me it was better to enlist. They said at least you had the chance to pick something other than the infantry. Mr. Grondin and I finished getting the barn ready for the night. The stalls had all been cleaned and filled with crisp hay, the color of freshly bottled honey. The old droppings or floppies had all been raked into a big black wheelbarrow that stayed near the front end of the barn. I just needed to grab the heavy, dense handles and with one extended effort, wheel them over to the shit pit, as I called it. It was the deep hollow behind the barn. In the spring, Mr. Grondin would use the tractor and load the flatbed trailer full of the half-frozen composted manure. With one of the farmhands, Charlie or Joe, standing on the rough oak planking, he'd drive to the cornfields that surrounded the white farmhouse. And together they'd spend the morning spreading and turning the dark brown chunks of hay and waste into rich New England soil, land that would only become richer because of the hard, steady work. Most years, in late April, after the work was done and just before spring planting started, the Grondin farmhouse would seem to emerge from a long winter's sleep. It stood alone, a single structure on a small half-acre plot, with deep green spring grass forming a barrier of sorts between the living and the land. As the inevitable afternoon winds came from the west, the solitary house was almost adrift, an island of green in a sea of soil. By the time I returned to the barn with the empty wheelbarrow, I knew I needed to enlist. My birthday was next week. 3 weeks after that was the first of the year, and then the draft started again. After that, I was fair game. Coming into the house from the farm, I knew my mother heard me open the screen door and the back door. She was cutting squash for dinner, and as I sat on the old milk stool near the coat rack, I heard the knife in her hand click every time she hit the cutting board. My boots were muddy and they had the aroma of the farm, but they weren't in the kitchen. From the smell of the pipe tobacco, I thought Dad was close by, probably in his chair in the living room. The radio was on, and I heard the newspaper pages rustle as he read over the day's events. Stepping into the linoleum floor, I took a deep breath, and it just started. Mom, Dad, my birthday's next week. I think I should enlist. My mom put the knife down. I heard her exhale as my dad got to his feet, and for a minute, they just looked at me. For once, I just started talking, trying as best I could to convince my mother and father that this was the best course of action. I showed them the list of dates. I talked to them about maybe training to become a heavy equipment mechanic. It'd be nice to get out of the service and get a job with the railroad, I said. It's better than waiting for that letter to come. The discussion didn't last more than 30 minutes, and without any other fanfare, it was decided. Verna Warner would drive me, the youngest of her 3 sons, to the recruiting offices in Springfield, Massachusetts. We'd go in a few days, maybe next week at the latest. My older brother, George, was already in the Army. He was stationed in Germany. He was safe at this point, and it didn't look like he'd be heading to Southeast Asia. Communications and electronics, my mom kept saying. That's what your brother's working on, and he's at a base. You should think about doing the same thing. My mom worked downtown at the Williamsburg Savings Bank, and they were closed on Wednesday afternoons. I thought we would go to Springfield after she got out of work, and I could tell my dad was not thrilled with the idea of me going into the service, but what choice did I have? Dad left for the VA hospital at 5 a.m. every morning and spent most of his time there working as a baker, making bread and rolls and pastries for the more than 250 patients and staff members who ate there each day. By the time he got home at night, there was little left of him for us. He was just too tired. It wasn't unusual for him to be asleep in his chair, his head tilted back at a funny angle by the time Walter Cronkite said goodnight. Wednesday came and Mom was home a little early. We left the house at 11 a.m. and headed the old black Buick south in the direction of Springfield and my future. Mom started in again about George and working in electronics, but I'd heard it all before and just looked further down the road. I wasn't my brother. I didn't want to repeat everything he did, even if it seemed to please my parents. I didn't want to make them mad, but I didn't want to be him. In a funny way, my mother and I were comfortable with each other in a way that required little speech. Any words that were said on the ride seemed to hang in the air, waiting for the other person to take them in and make them their own. Sooner or later, they'd come back out wrapped in a new thought or idea, and the 45-minute was quiet and quick. The offices for all the branches are close together, but I think the Army is the best choice for me, I said as my mother drove the sedan into the open-air parking lot.